In this lecture on Aristotle's Politics, we meet a person who was Plato's student and Plato's best critic, and we will be focusing on Aristotle's critique of Plato because it is the most profound critique that was offered in the tradition of Western political philosophy. Now, who was Aristotle? He was born in 384 BC, 44 years after Plato. He was born not in Athens, but in Macedonia to the north, and he came to Athens at age 17 to study with Plato at the academy, and he remained Plato's student for 20 years. It seems to me remarkable that Plato's student Aristotle should have become not only his most distinguished pupil, but also his best critic. It's a comment on Plato's ability as a teacher to produce a person of this magnitude. It's sometimes said that Plato is excessively dogmatic or intransigent in his views. But if he were that bad, then certainly he couldn't have produced someone of Aristotle's worth. That is, a student who was also able to reflect on Plato and to criticize him after having studied with him for a full 20 years. After Plato's death, Aristotle then founded his own school right next to Plato's in Athens called the Lyceum, and there Aristotle wrote several treatises. But the one that we're focusing on now is called the Politics. He wrote the Politics not only to refute Plato, but also to set forth his own political theory. And it became such an important political theory that it's been said that all of us since in the Western tradition are either with Plato or with Aristotle. We're Platonists or we are Aristotelians. It is for us to decide which of these two great philosophies we prefer. And our purpose today now is to look at one philosophy against the other, to compare, but above all, to contrast. The Politics of Aristotle begins with the words, "Observation shows us." And then he goes on to argue that through empirical analysis, that is, through observation of concrete phenomena, we can infer certain facts, certain conclusions. Now, that's important because observation is a term that doesn't occur in Plato's Republic very often. Plato is concerned with deducing great axioms, as one would, as a student, say, of geometry or of physics. From Aristotle's point of view, one infers ideas as a biologist would or a chemist would, looking at the human species as a laboratory and understanding it on the basis of this empirical analysis. It's not for nothing that Aristotle's father was a doctor and that Aristotle studied biology very deeply. It was the empirical analysis used by the biologist that fascinated Aristotle. Unlike Plato, then, he seeks the truth by examining the actual rather than speculating on the ideal. And this portrait, this magnificent portrait by Raphael that we have here, illustrates this. That is, at the center of the portrait we have Plato and Aristotle. Notice the gestures of each of these two figures. Plato is gesturing on high, his finger pointing to the heavens, as if to say to Aristotle, his student, the truth, Aristotle, lies with the ideals, with the archetypal patterns, with those noble eternal truths of justice and beauty and goodness that are the abstract reality that we must study. Aristotle's gesture is looking to Plato, significant as well. He has his hand outstretched and looking ahead and not on high. He's viewing the world of reality around him and gesturing at once to that world of facts, of cogent and concrete phenomena, as well as the gesture, I think, means a gesture of moderation, gesturing saying to Plato that moderation in all things, or the golden mean, is what we must strive to achieve. I think he's imagining, as he looks to Plato, cool it, Plato. You've gone to extremes in the Republic. Let's think in terms of reality so that we do not take fanatical, extremist steps towards the kind of revolution that you propose. Aristotle believes, then, that the best we can attain is not an otherworldly republic, a utopia, but rather a mean of moderation here on earth. And this mean, this moderate but good life, can be achieved only if we cease to build efforts at constructing imaginary utopias and concentrate instead on a very practical goal of the right kind of state that is attainable, that's workable, that's practical. The problem with Plato, then, according to Aristotle, is that he's a revolutionary. He is trying to change the world so that we may attain an impossible dream, a model that can never exist. Now, for all of his emphasis on reason, and Plato certainly is identified as a rationalist, Aristotle sees Plato as wholly irrational and unreasonable in these demands for change that he set forth in the Republic. So we want to look at Aristotle's response in the Politics in a very systematic and thoughtful way to the three waves of change that we reviewed in the lecture on Plato. These three tidal waves, remember, of revolutionary transformation that's to sweep over the old corrupt polis and transform it into the Republic. Let's examine the arguments that Aristotle actually makes in the Politics, looking at Aristotle's text and the way in which the exciting debate occurs between the two of them. We can only wonder whether or not, when Aristotle was studying with Plato during these 20 years, this debate actually occurred, or whether after Plato died, Aristotle came to these conclusions. But in any case, political theory is exciting because it does contain these debates, this conversation among the greats, as we call them. And when we look at Aristotle and Plato, we find these two people joining issue on vital problems. The three waves represent key questions, as we've seen. Now let's review them to make sure we've understood what Plato has said in the Republic and to what Aristotle is responding. Remember, first Plato made the revolutionary point that women could rule. Now this was so extreme. Nowhere in the ancient world was anything remotely like this reform or change suggested or approached. In Asia as well as in Greece, women were seen as necessarily part of the family, in the home, not involved in public but only private life, with no rights of property, as we've said. Sometimes women, of course, were despised and treated as slaves. Aristotle will not argue that that should be the case. That is, he wants women to be respected as faithful wives and good mothers, productive especially of sons. But when he argues against Plato on this issue, he's arguing against then a truly revolutionary step on Plato's part. Remember, Plato argued in the Republic that the nature of women should not disqualify them. That is, just because they were sexually different from men, they could still be qualified leaders. They could serve in politics. If, Plato argues, women were only given the opportunity to become educated in politics, then they could show their abilities, and they may become then able to serve in positions of political power. They could compete for these positions. Now, Aristotle denied all of this. He asserted, in accord with the conventional wisdom of ancient Greece, that the best place for women is in the home, serving in their natural capacities. Women deserved respect. They deserved honor in this function because it was clearly indispensable for any society to survive. Women must be in this position. But Aristotle went further and argued that they are by nature suited peculiarly for this task. And he finds justification for his argument in his theory of the soul, of human nature itself. Since they are by nature then suited for this position, they cannot change. Now here's what he says specifically in the Politics. He's talking specifically about the nature of men and women and the nature of the soul. The soul, he says, has naturally two elements, a ruling and a ruled, and each has its different goodness, one belonging to the rational and ruling element and the other to the irrational and ruled. What is true of the soul is evidently also true of the household and the state, and we may thus conclude that it's a general law that there should be naturally ruling elements and elements naturally ruled. The rule of the free man over the slave is one kind of rule. That of the male over the female is another. The slave is entirely without the faculty of reason. The female possesses the faculty of reason, but in a form which must remain ineffective. This is her nature. Her soul has a quality of reason in it, yes, but not a quality of reason that can compare with the male. Men have superior reason. They're superior by nature. Their souls have this stronger element of rationality in it. Women, by the nature of their soul, are meant then to be ruled by men, the superior ruling force in society. And it's interesting that this is part of his general discussion of his theory of the household or of home economics. That is the way in which the home should be managed. The woman has a critical place in the home, but the woman is naturally ruled by the male. He likes to quote a passage from the Greek poet Sophocles. He says, "We must therefore hold that what the poet Sophocles said of woman," and here is the quotation from Sophocles, "a modest silence is a woman's crown." This is a saying which implies that there's a special form of goodness for women, and it contains then a definite truth, but a truth which does not apply to men. So this particular kind of goodness for women is to serve, to be silent, to perform their capacities in the home, and not to mix in politics. Under no circumstances are they to serve in positions of rule. Plato's suggestion then is revolutionary to the extreme and characterizes Plato's whole attitude towards society and politics. That is, extremist. Now Aristotle takes up the second wave. Remember the second wave in Plato, and that is to create the extended family of rulers and to abolish among these people family, that is the nuclear family, and property. Both of these institutions were not to be known among the ruling elite for reasons that we've explained in the Plato lecture. That is, this educated larger family would be liberated from narrow family concerns and not tempted by nepotism or by possessiveness. Aristotle replies, first of all, that this suggestion is entirely impractical and undesirable. It's undesirable because, from Aristotle's point of view, the family is natural, it's necessary in order to socialize individuals, it produces values, family values of trust, of loyalty, of a sense of affection, bonds that are vital for the state. And the family is then one way to socialize individuals on the way to their understanding in the polis or in the state of these larger values of loyalty. We meet these values of loyalty and trust first in the family. One learns responsibility and obligation in the family. For Plato to wipe this away would mean that he would create a state that would have no values of this sort. He continues in his refutation of Plato, arguing that if we were to institute Plato's idea of creating this extended large family, then we would have a group of individuals who are careless in their attitudes towards one another. Because, he says, what is common to the greatest number always gets the least amount of care. Men pay most attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common. Men are more prone to neglect their duty when they think that another is attending to it. Therefore, the scheme of Plato means that in this vast, extended family that he has in mind, each citizen may have 1,000 sons. They will not be the sons of each citizen individually. Any and every son will be equally the son of any and every father, since fathers and mothers won't know their children in this state. And the result will be that every son will be equally neglected by every father. From Aristotle's point of view, this kind of vision to create this extended family where there are exceptional types, highly educated elites, it's utterly fanciful. But you see, it destroys the natural bonds of the family itself. It violates the very values of loyalty and love and trust and affection that must be instilled early on. Aristotle speaks eloquently of the spirit of fraternity, the bond of fraternity, and he said this is likely to exist in the very least degree in Plato's system when family bonds are loosened. In Plato's Republic, it would be merely a watery sort of fraternity. A father would be very little disposed to say mine of a son, and a son would be as little disposed to say mine of a father, just as a little sweet wine mixed with a great deal of water necessarily produces a tasteless mixture. So family feeling is diluted and tasteless when family names have so little meaning as they have in a constitution of the Platonic Republic. And when there is so little reason for a father treating his sons as sons, or a son treating his father as a father, or brothers one another as brothers. Men care for their family, he says, or for their property, when they can identify truly with them as their own, as their possessions. They can't do this in Plato's system. And this, Aristotle says, takes us to Plato's theory of the abolition of private property, where we can apply the same logic. Aristotle attacks Plato's theory in this second wave of Plato's that property should be abolished with vigor. And note he carries the same logic that he has introduced in his attack on Plato's theory that family should be abolished. He says, we must conclude, whether we're considering family or property, that to think of a thing as your own makes an inexpressible difference. The satisfaction of a natural feeling brings pleasure, and it may well be that regard for one's self, and by extension for what is one's own, is a feeling implanted by nature, not a random impulse. The simple feeling of love for any of these things, family, property, money, is universal. We may add that a very great pleasure is to be found in doing a kindness and giving some help to friends or guests or comrades, and such kindness and help become possible only when property is privately owned. In a state such as Plato's, with property in common, no man can show himself liberal, or indeed do a liberal act, for the function of liberality consists in the proper use which is made of property. So here's a valuable point. Aristotle is saying that in order to be liberal and generous and charitable, you have to have some property to give away. And he's trusting people that if they do own property, they do accumulate money, that they will be generous with it. He says that there must be a limit to the accumulation of wealth. It shouldn't be exorbitant to a point where you couldn't possibly use it. But when you accumulate wealth, you're accumulating a power to be generous and good to society. Allow that kind of institution of private property then, from Aristotle's point of view, to continue, to survive, to flourish, because it's the stuff of good feeling, of affection, fraternity, and the bonds that both the family and the institution of private property set forth. You see what he's saying here, and that is, the important point is that Plato is unnatural in his requirements, that we like to own things, to possess them, to have them, to know them, and to give up these, from Aristotle's point of view, is to become something superhuman or less than human. We must not do that. We want to treasure our humanity, and the value of property and family is a part of that treasure. Remember, Plato had three waves. The third wave was to put all power in the hands of the guardians, that is, of this intellectual elite, so that the just state could be constructed. And Aristotle attacks this third wave with vigor equal to the attack on the previous two about women and the one embracing both family and property. He says, when we view Plato's insistence that all power should be concentrated in the hands of a few, these few being, remember, the rational guardians, those who can rule a state justly, there is an element of danger in this reform that Plato proposes to institute. He makes one body of persons the permanent rulers of his state, thus rejecting the principle that I favor, he says, of ruling and being ruled in turn. This system, Aristotle argues, must breed in the state discontent and dissension. And I think it's really important to note how Aristotle, from a practical point of view, says of Plato's supposed revolutionary change that it must breed civil war. It will breed discontent and dissension, because those who have not got the power are bound to revolt against the few who have it. And remember, from Plato's point of view, the vast majority of people in the state will not have any political power at all. This can only breed, then, immense dissatisfaction, Aristotle says. But Aristotle goes further than that. He says there can't be any happiness at all in Plato's utopia. The majority will be unhappy, of course, because they don't have political power or any say in government. That's clear. But Aristotle says the philosophers will be unhappy as well, because they're deprived of their natural need for family and for property, as Plato says. That is, his chosen few, his rational rulers, his guardians, they can't have private property or the family bonds that, from Aristotle's point of view, are the real stuff of life. And so they're going to be miserable. So Aristotle says if you wanted to construct a state that is universally unhappy, then that would be Plato's state. No one, even those on top who are deprived of family and property, are going to be fulfilled. And so Aristotle proposes his alternative, which is a much better state from Aristotle's point of view, because it could work. And this is ruled by the middle class. The larger this class, the better. And later on in the book, in this magnificent text, The Politics, Aristotle sets forth his mean of moderation, that is, his ideal state. An ideal which, not like Plato's, an ideal up in the heavens somewhere, but an ideal that can be realized in this life. He says, we want to consider what is the best kind of state and the best way of life for the majority of states and men. We won't employ, as Plato does, a standard of excellence above the reach of ordinary mortals. We shall only be concerned with the sort of life which most men are able to share and the sort of constitution which it is possible for most states to enjoy. If we adopt as true the statements that I have made in the Ethics is Aristotle's other great book, And the two, the ethics and the politics, should be read, of course, together, because the ethics, again, enforces this key principle of moderation in all things. If we look at the ethics, that a truly happy life is a life of goodness, and that goodness consists in a mean of moderation, it follows that the best way of life for the majority of men is one which consists in a mean of the kind attainable of every individual. In all states, there may be distinguished three parts or classes of the citizen body. There may be, he says, the very rich, the very poor, and the middle class, which forms the most moderate in between. Now it is admitted as a general principle, he says, if we observe life, as we must, that moderation and the mean are always best. By the mean, he means this principle, the golden mean of the best between the two extremes. We may therefore conclude that a middle condition will be the best. Men who are in this condition are the most ready, this is the middle class, to listen to reason. Those who belong to either extreme, whether they be the over-wealthy at one hand or the opposite end, the over-poor, these find it hard to follow the lead of reason. Why does he think that the middle class is most able to reason? Because the middle class has a stake in the system, and that is a stake in owning property. It's clear from our argument, then, Aristotle concludes, that the best form of political society is one where power is vested in the middle class, and that good government is attainable in those states where there is a large middle class. It's therefore the greatest of blessings for a state that its members should possess a moderate and adequate property. Where some have great possessions and others have nothing at all, the result is either an extreme democracy or an unmixed oligarchy. What we want is neither an oligarchy nor a democracy, but in between what he calls a polity. And a polity is ruled by the middle class. How is it different from a democracy? A democracy is what he knew in Athens. That is, everyone could vote as long as they were males, regardless of literacy or property. Aristotle wants to restrict political participation to those who have property and those who are literate, who have some education. Where the middle class is large, there is least likelihood of faction and dissension among the citizens. Now, I think that this is a vital point that needs to be emphasized. That is, the way in which Aristotle is coming down so hard here in favor of the middle class. He's in favor of property and family too. But the way in which he wants power diversified among the middle class, members of the middle class, is crucial because it says so much about his theory of power. From Plato's point of view, remember, power must be concentrated among a few, the most qualified, the rational, the educated, the highly educated. And if it is concentrated, then the state can be ruled justly. A just state can be attained only if that is done. From Aristotle's point of view, that will necessarily result in tyranny or despotism, because if power is concentrated absolutely, it means absolute corruption. No group of individuals can be trusted from Aristotle's point of view with that much power. When we look then at his very considered and rational critique of Plato's theory of power, it has this element, a realistic assessment of the situation, a realistic conclusion that the middle class represents those people who can be trusted with power because power is dispersed among them and not concentrated in the hands of a few. That contention that absolute power will corrupt absolutely is vital to Aristotle, and he's the one who suggests it early on in countering Plato's argument. He is sometimes seen as the granddaddy or great-granddaddy of capitalism because he is for the bourgeoisie and the middle class. But I like to see him instead as a philosopher of moderation, with his hand outstretched to the mean, saying to Plato, don't go to those extremes. Extremism means fanaticism and dogmatism. Think instead, Plato, of reason among those, the middle class, that can administer the kind of government that we both want, a government that will bring in a practical state of justice.